The Daily Life of the Aztecs on the Eve of the Spanish Conquest. Chapter 3. The World, Man, and Time. A shifting, threatened world. The myth of the four suns. The supreme duality. The birth of the sun. The meaning of the human sacrifices. The sacred war. The Mexicans' intensely anxious views of the world. Heaven and earth. The Mexicans as people of the sun. Huitzilopochtli. Tlaloc, the earth and the goddesses of the earth. Tlazoteotl, the goddess of love. The moon and the gods of drunkenness. Xipetotec, death and rebirth. A constant theme of native thought. Vegetation, Quetzalcoatl, the sun. The abodes of the dead. Destinies and signs. The solar year and the divinatory calendar. The Tonapwali and the prime axis of the universe. Predestination, omens and apparitions. The strong pessimism of the Aztecs, an imperial religion. The Mexican, a receptive religion, a welcoming pantheon, syncretism and theological doctrines, belief in a supreme God. A shifting, threatened world. The Mexicans, like some other Central American peoples, believe that the successive worlds had existed before ours, and that each of them had fallen into ruins amid cataclysms in which mankind had been wiped out. These were the four suns, and the age in which we live is the fifth. Each of these suns is shown on the monuments such as the Aztec calendar, or the sun, or the stone of the suns by a date which is that of its end and which evokes the nature of the catastrophe which ended it. In this way, the fourth epoch, for example, the son of the water, which was drowned in a kind of flood, has the date Nawiat, for water. Our world will have the same fate. Its destiny is fixed by the date which has, as one might say, branded it at birth. The date, Nawi Olin, at which our sun first began to move. The glyph Olin, shaped like a St. Andrew's cross, which shares the center of the Aztec calendar with the sun god's visage, has a double sense of movement and of earthquake. It symbolizes both the first notion of the heavenly body when our age began and the cataclysms that will destroy our earth. At that moment, the appearance of reality will be ripped open like a veil, and the Tzintzimi, the monsters of the twilight who await the fatal hour beneath the western sky, will swarm out and hurl themselves upon the last survivors. The ancient Mexicans believed in two primordial beings who were at the origin of all others, even of the gods. They were Ometecutli, the lord of the duality, and Omecihuatl, the lady of the duality, and they lived at the summit of the world in the 13th heaven, there where the air was very cold, delicate, and iced. Their unending fruitfulness produced all the gods, and from it mankind was born. At the time which this book is concerned, these two great divinities have come in some degree to resemble those kings who reign but do not govern. They have been pushed into the background by the vigorous crowd of younger and more active gods. But it was still they who were held to have the privilege of fixing the birth date of each living being, and thus its fate. The gods, the descendants of the supreme duality, in their turn were the creators of the earth. The most important act in this creation was clearly the birth of the sun, and the sun was born from sacrifice and blood. It is said that the gods gathered in the twilight at Teotihuacan, and one of them, a little leprous god, covered with boils, threw himself into the huge brazier as a sacrifice. He rose from the blazing coals, changed into a sun. But this new sun was motionless. It needed blood to move. So the gods immolated themselves, and the sun, drawing life from their death, began its course across the sky. This was the beginning of the cosmic drama in which humanity took on the role of the gods. To keep the sun moving on its course, so that the darkness should not overwhelm the world forever, it was necessary to feed it every day with its food, the precious water, Chalchihuat, that is, with human blood. Sacrifice was a sacred duty towards the sun, and a necessity for the welfare of men. Without it, the very life of the world would stop. Every time that a priest on the top of a pyramid held up the bleeding heart of a man and then placed it in the Guachicali, the disaster that perpetually threatened to fall upon the world was postponed once more. Human sacrifice was an alchemy by which life was made out of death, and the gods themselves had given the example on the first day of creation. As for man, his very first duty was to provide nourishment. Intonan tota tlatekutli tonatio, for our mother and our father, the earth and the sun. And to shirk this was to betray the gods, and at the same time all mankind, for what was true of the sun was also true of the earth, the rain, growth, and all the forces of nature. Nothing was born, nothing would endure, except by the blood of sacrifice. The great god-king of the Toltecs, Quetzalcoatl, never would offer up human victims because he so loved his subjects, the Toltecs, and he presented only snakes in sacrifice, and birds and butterflies. But Quetzalcoatl was expelled from Tula by the black magic of Tezcatlipoca, and so Mexico was delivered over to the bloodthirsty gods. In the most usual form of the rite, the victim was stretched out on his back on a slightly convex stone with his arms and legs held by 4 priests, while a 5th ripped him open with a flint knife and tore out his heart. The sacrifice also often took place in the manner which the Spaniards describe as gladiatorio. The captive was tied to a huge disc of stone, the tamalalcat, by a rope that left him free to move. He was armed with wooden weapons, and he had to fight several normally armed Aztec warriors in turn. If, by any extraordinary chance, he did not succumb to their attacks, he was spared. But nearly always the gladiator fell, gravely wounded, and a few moments later he died on the stone, with his body opened by the black-robed, long-haired priests. The warriors who were set apart for this kind of death wore ornaments and clothes of a special nature, and they were crowned with white down, as a symbol of the first light of dawn, of the still uncertain hour when the soul of the resuscitated warrior takes its flight in the greyness towards our Father, the Sun. But these were not the only forms of sacrifice. Women were dedicated to the goddesses of the earth, and while they danced, pretending to be unaware of their fate, their heads were struck off. Children were drowned as an offering to the rain god Tlaloc, the fire gods' victims. Anesthetized by Yautli, hashish, were thrown into the blaze, and those who personified the god Xipetotec were fastened to a kind of frame, shot with arrows and then flayed. The priests dressed themselves in the skin. In most cases, the victim was dressed, painted, and ornamented so as to represent the god who was being worshipped, and thus it was the god himself who died before his own image and in his own temple, just as all the gods had accepted death in the first days for the salvation of the world. And when ritual cannibalism was practiced on certain occasions, it was the god's own flesh that the faithful ate in their bloody communion. There is no aspect of Mexican civilization that shocks our feelings as much as this. From the first contact between the Indians and the Europeans, the horror and disgust that the newcomers felt for the human sacrifices helped them to convince themselves that the native religion came from hell and that its gods were no more than devils. From then onwards, they were certain that Huitzilopochtli, Tlaloc, Tezcatlipoca, and all the other gods of Mexico were in fact demons, and that everything that concerned them, either directly or remotely, should be rooted out forever. The Aztec practice of human sacrifice was a great factor in making two religions which confronted one another totally irreconcilable. And when the war broke out between the Spaniards and the Mexicans, in giving it a bitter and remorseless character from the moment the helpless conquistadors saw from afar the death of their comrades, whose grinning skulls they later found exposed on the Tzompantli. Clearly, it is difficult for us to try to come to a true understanding of what human sacrifice meant to the 16th century Aztec, but it may be observed that every culture possesses his own idea of what is and what is not cruel. At the height of their career, the Romans shed more blood in their circuses and for their amusement than ever the Aztecs did before their idols. The Spaniards, so sincerely moved by the cruelty of the native priests, nevertheless massacred, burnt, mutilated, and tortured with a perfectly clear conscience. We, who shudder at the tale of the bloody rites of ancient Mexico, have seen with our own eyes and in our own day civilized nations proceed systematically to the extermination of millions of human beings and to the perfection of weapons capable of annihilating in 1 second 100 times more victims than the Aztecs ever sacrificed. Human sacrifice among the Mexicans was inspired neither by cruelty nor by hatred. It was their response, and the only response that they could conceive, to the instability of a continually threatened world. Blood was necessary to save this world and the men in it. The victim was no longer an enemy who was to be killed, but a messenger, arrayed in a dignity that was almost divine, who was sent to the gods. All the relevant descriptions, such as those that Sahagún took down from his Aztec informants, for example, convey the impression not of a dislike between the sacrificer and the victim, nor of anything resembling a lust for blood, but of a strange fellow feeling, or rather, this is vouched for by the text, of a kind of mythical kinship. When a man took a prisoner, he said, "Here is my well-beloved son," and the captive said, "Here is my revered father." The warrior who had made a prisoner, and who watched him die before the altar, knew that sooner or later he would follow him into the hereafter by the same kind of death. "You are welcome. You know what the fortune of war is. Today for you, tomorrow for me," said the emperor to a captured chief. As for the prisoner himself, he was perfectly aware of his fate, and he had been prepared from his childhood to accept it. He agreed stoically. More than that, he would refuse a clemency that crossed his destiny or the divine will, even if it were offered to him. Tlacahuepan, the Mexican leader, who was a prisoner of the Chalca in the reign of Moctezuma I, had distinguished himself so much by his bravery that when he was captured, his enemies offered him a part of their territory for himself, and the other, Aztecs, they had taken. He would not only have his life, but he would be lord of that section. They even asked him to command the troops of Chalco. Tlacahuepan's only reply was to kill himself, shouting to his fellow prisoners, "Mexicans, I am going, and I shall wait for you." The story of Tlahuicole, a lord of Tlaxcala, who was taken by the Mexicans, was no less famous. They admired him so much that instead of sacrificing him, they entrusted him with the command of a body of soldiers in the war against Michoacan. But on his return, covered with honors from this expedition, the Tlaxcaltec refused to withhold himself any longer from his fate. He insisted upon his death, and died upon the sacrificial stone. To a less extent, this was also the attitude of all the other victims. It was the attitude of the young man who, having lived for a year in princely luxury, was to die at the end of it in front of the image of Tezcatlipoca. And it was that of the woman who calmly danced and sang while the dark-robed priest behind him waited for the moment to make their heads fall like ears of maize when they are plucked from the stem. The sensitivity of the Indians, molded by a powerful and very ancient tradition, was not the same as that of the Europeans of their epoch. The Aztecs were unmoved by the scenes in their blood-soaked temples, but they were horror-struck by the tortures that the Spaniards brought with them from the land of the Inquisition. It is only these foregoing considerations that allow one to understand the meaning of the war for the ancient Mexicans, the meaning of continual war towards which all the energies of the city were directed. Certainly, it is not incorrect to interpret the history of Tenochtitlan between 1325 and 1519 as that of an imperialist state which steadily pursues its aim of expansion by conquest. But that is not all. As the Mexican dominion spread, so their very victories created a pacified zone all round them, a zone which grew wider and wider until it reached the edges of their known world. Where then were the victims were to come from? For they were essential to provide the gods with their nourishment. Tlaxcaltilitzli. Where could one find the precious blood without the sun, and the whole frame of the universe was condemned to annihilation? It was essential to remain in a state of war, and from this need arose the strange institution of the War of Flowers, Xochitl, which seems to have come into being after the terrible famines which ravaged central Mexico in 1450. The sovereigns of Mexico, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, and the lords of Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, and Cholula mutually agreed that, there being no war, they would arrange combats, so that the captives might be sacrificed to the gods. For it was thought, indeed, that the calamities of 1450 were caused by too few victims having been offered, so that the gods had grown angry. Fighting was primarily a means of taking prisoners. On the battlefield, the warriors did their utmost to kill as few men as possible. War was not merely a political instrument. It was above all a religious rite, a war of holiness. At the bottom, the ancient Mexicans had no real confidence in the future. Their fragile world was perpetually at the mercy of some disaster. There were not only the natural cataclysms and the famines, but more than that, on certain nights, the monstrous divinities of the West appeared at the crossroads, and there were the wizards, those dark envoys from a mysterious world. And every 52 years there was the great fear that fell upon all the nations of the empire when the sun set on the last day of the century, and no man could tell whether it would rise ever again. In all these cities and throughout the countryside, the fires were put out. The close-packed crowds, filled with intense anxiety, gathered on the slopes of Wishatakad, while on the mountaintop the priests watched the Pleiades. The constellation mounted towards the zenith, but would it go on, or would it stop? And would the hideous monsters of the end of the world come swarming out? The astronomer priest made a sign. A prisoner was stretched out on the stone. With a dull sound, the flint knife opened his chest, and in the gaping wound, they spun the fire stick, the lekwawit. The miracle took place, and the flame sprang up, born from the shattered breast. And amid shouts of joy, messengers lit their torches at it and ran to carry the sacred fire to the four corners of the central valley. And so the world had escaped its end once more. But how heavy and blood-drenched a task it was for the priests and the warriors and the emperors, century after century, to repel the unceasing onslaughts of the void. Heaven and death. The Aztecs were above all the people of the sun. Their supreme god Huitzilopochtli personified the sun at its height, the blazing sun of noon. His mother, Coatlicue, she of the serpent skirt, a terrestrial goddess, had borne innumerable stellar gods before him, gods called the 400 of the south, as well as the lunar goddess Coyolchalki, the incarnation of the shades of night. According to tradition, Coatlicue was miraculously got with child by a ball of feathers that fell from the sky, the soul of a human sacrifice, and her son, born already armed with his fire snake, Xiuquat, made his brothers and his sisters flee as the sun chases away the night and wipes out the stars. The early days of Huitzilopochtli were hard, for then he was no more than the obscure god of a small wandering tribe, traveling on men's backs across the dusty plain of the north. At the time he was only a plebeian, no more than a man. Kan Masawali, Kant Lakat Katka, but he was also Nawali Tetzawit, a wizard, an apparition, a marvel. His fortunes improved with those of the tribe that he led, and by the 16th century he reigned over the Aztec Empire as the sun reigns over the world. "Thanks to me the sun has risen," he cried through the mouth of his priests. As the god of a tribe of hunters and warriors from the north, Huitzilopochtli belonged to a group of stellar and celestial gods who had been brought down by the northern nations that had invaded Mexico. Gods such as Tezcatlipoca, the god of the Great Bear of the night sky, the Protean wizard who sees all in his obsidian mirror, the young man Telpochtli, who protects the young warriors, and Mishcoat, the god of the Milky Way, the protector of hunters, and, under the name of Kamashli, the national god of Tlaxcala. It may be that the nomads of the steppes knew only a small number of deities, and that their religion was essentially, if not entirely, astral. The settled people of the central plateau, on the other hand, from the remotest antiquity, had worshipped the agrarian gods of growth and the rain. The greatest of these was Tlaloc, with his mask of snakes, he who piles the clouds upon the mountaintops where the Tlaloque live, the little rain gods, and who sends out either the beneficent rain or the devastating hurricane at his pleasure, and who can release the horror of drought upon the land. "O my lord, magician prince, truly it is to you that the maize belongs," they said to him. He was the supreme god of the peasants, as Huitzilopochtli was that of the warriors. And as we have seen, his place was on the top of the great Teocalli of the capital, beside Huitzilopochtli's, and equal with his. His high priest ranked with the high priest of the sun god. The sun and the rain, the two great forces that ruled the world, shared the high place of a city that had been founded by a people of nomadic warriors turned farmers. Tlaloc's companion, Xiuquat, she who has a skirt of gems, was usually placed beside him, together with Wishtosiwat. Xiuquat was the goddess of sweet water, and Wishtosiwat of salt water and of the sea. She was the goddess of the guild of salters. The earth was symbolized by a monster with wide-open jaws which swallows the sun in its heading, the remains of the dead, and the blood of the sacrificed. The monster was always put on a level with the old god, the father god, associated with the mother goddess, that is to say, Xiuquatli, the god of fire, the lord of the turquoise, sometimes called Ontontecutli, Otomi Lord, the ancient tribe of the Central Plateau having in effect worshipped a divine pair. But besides these, there were a great number of terrestrial deities, the mother of the gods, our revered mother, our ancestress, the she-snake, the obsidian butterfly, all wonderful and formidable goddesses, sources of life and death. Aztec sculpture represents them with an extraordinary balance of realism in the details and of the most esoteric symbolism in the conception, with features that are half human and half animal, and with macabre ornaments. They are compared in hymns to the white and yellow flowers that open when the rains come, or described as standing in the sacred maize field, Centlateomilco, waving the magic bell that makes the grain-bearing plant come up. They are the great masters who gave birth to the young god of maize, Centeot, and the young gods of music, dancing, and flowers, Xochipilli and Maquisochit. The two faces of the world and of life, benign and terrifying, are brought together in them. Not far from them, and often represented with the same kind of attributes, although she was of a different origin, her cult seems to have been brought in the form of Huastec country in the northeast, was Tlazoteot, the goddess of carnal love and of sin and of confession. It was to her that one could, through a priest, confess one's sins, but unlike the Christian practice, this happened only once in a man's lifetime. The goddess was called Tlalguani, the eater of filth, that is to say, she who eats sins. For the ancient Mexicans, as for many other agricultural peoples, there was a close link between the moon and vegetation. Metzli, the moon, had been closely followed in its phases and eclipses by native astronomers since Mayan times. The terrestrial goddesses were at the same time goddesses of the moon. There was also the uncountable numbers of little local gods who were held to protect the harvests and make them plentiful. Usually each one had the name of the town or village where he was worshipped. Tepostecat, for example, he of Tepoztlan, and as a body they were called the 400 rabbits. The rabbit was held to represent the moon, for it was a rabbit that the Mexicans saw in the dark patches on its face. These rustic gods had their festival at the end of the harvest, and at these feasts the Ocli flowed in abundance. They were therefore also the gods of drunkenness. While Tlazoteot came from the northeast, it was probably from the south, from the Pacific coast, that they imported the terrible cult of Xipetotec, our lord of the flayed one, the god of the goldsmiths, and also the deity of the spring rain, the renewal of nature and the fresh growth. His victims were dedicated to him during the month Tlakashi Pewalitzli, and transfixed with arrows so that their blood should drop on the earth like rain. Then they were flayed. The priest put on their skin dyed yellow to look like gold leaf, and this magical act, which symbolized the way the earth makes a new skin at the beginning of the rainy season, induced the vegetation to come again. Xipetotec was called the drinker by night, because it was at night that the fertilizing rain came down. They called upon him most pitifully, crying, "Oh my God, why do you make us beg so hard? Put on your golden clothes." And they thanked him in a heartfelt way. "My God, your gem-like rain has fallen." That was one of the aspects of the eternally repeated drama of the year, the rebirth of the forces of nature and of growth after they had apparently died in the dry season. The whole of ancient Mexican thought, and their whole vision of the world, turned about this central idea, whether it concerned man or nature. Death and rebirth. Maize and the garden plants are born in the Occident, in the western garden of Tamuanchan, where the earth goddesses live, the sources of life. Then they undertake a long journey under the ground, that of germination, praying the gods of rain to guide them on their road. At last they come up in the east, the country of the rising sun and of youth and plenty, in the red land of the dawn, where the birth Quetzalcoatl sings. Let me say that again. At last they come up in the east, the country of the rising sun and of youth and plenty, the red land of the dawn, where the bird Quetzalcoatl sings. Venus, the morning star, is born in the east. Then she disappears, and she is seen again as the evening star in the west. She has therefore traversed the world as a shuttle traverses the cloth. She is the symbol of death and rebirth. In the divinity, the planet was called Quetzalcoatl, Quetzal snake or plume serpent, a name which can also be interpreted as meaning precious twin, since the two appearances of the planet are like two twin stars. Quetzalcoatl sacrificed himself upon a pyre, and a brilliant star was seen to rise from the flames. Under the name of Cholot, the dog-headed god, he went under the earth, down to the hell of Mictlan, to seek for the worn bones of those long dead, in order to make living men out of them. Was not Huitzilopochtli, the conquering sun, the reincarnation of a dead warrior? He was born miraculously, as we have seen, and it was the soul of a man killed in battle or in sacrifice that impregnated his mother, the earth. His name, the Hummingbird Huitzilin, from the left means the rebirth warrior from the south. For the south is the left-hand side of the world, and warriors are reborn in the minute, brilliant body of a hummingbird. Thus, neither nature nor man are to be sent to an everlasting death. Resurrecting forces are at work. The sun comes up again each morning after passing the night under the holy plain Teotlali Itik. That is to say, in Hades. Venus dies and is reborn. The maize dies and is reborn. The whole world of plants, struck dead in the dry season, arises more beautiful and younger each season of the rains, just as the moon dwindles in the sky and returns according to the rhythm of its phases. Death and life are no more than two sides of the same reality. From the earliest times, the potters of Tlatilco made a double face, one half alive and the other skull-like. And the dualism is also to be found in innumerable documents. Perhaps no people in history have been so much haunted by the grim presence of death as the Mexicans. But for them, life came out of death, as the young plant comes from the moldering seed in the earth. As for man himself, and what became of him after his death, our knowledge is still somewhat incomplete. It is sure, however, that some kinds of immortality were provided, but without any moral connotation, either of reward or of punishment. The warrior who died in battle or upon the stones of sacrifice became a companion of the eagle, Cuauhtecat, that is to say, a companion of the sun. Every day he would take his place with his fellows in the brilliant and happy company that surrounded the luminary from the time that it rose in the east until the time that it reached the zenith. These immortal soldiers filled their sunlit hours with war songs and mock battles, and after 4 years they were reincarnated as hummingbirds, flying from flower to flower in the warm air. As soon as the sun had passed the zenith, it came into the western side of the world, the female side, Ciutlampa, because that is where the goddess mothers lived, and also the women who died in childbirth, and who thus became goddesses too, the Cihuateteo. It was they, in their world, who accompanied the sun from the zenith to its setting. Other dead people had been selected by fate for a very different kind of eternity, those upon whom Tlaloc had set his mark, and who had been drowned or struck by lightning, or who had died of a disease thought to be brought about by water, dropsy, for example. The peasant god had reserved his own paradise for them, Tlalocan, an idealized vision of the eastern tropics, a green country of flowers and warm rain. It was a garden of repose and plenty, where the blessed live forever in a peaceful happiness. In this way, the two ideologies of the two elements that had formed the Mexican people came together. The first element, hunters and warriors, worshippers of a sun god, and the second, settled peasants whose deity was the god of the rain. For the first, there was the brilliant road from the Orient to the zenith, and for the others, the mild happiness of abundance without trouble or labor in the moist green tropical paradise. But what happened to the others, to those who were not singled out by either Huitzilopochtli or Tlaloc? It was but a dreary outlook for these undistinguished corpses, for they had nowhere to go except Mictlan, the underworld which lay beneath the great steppes of the north in the cold twilight country. Mictlantecutli and his wife Mictecasihuat reigned there. The Mexican Pluto's face was covered with a bony mask, and he sat among owls and spiders. Even so, it was not easy for the dead man to reach his last resting place. He had to wander 4 years in the underworld together with a soul companion, a dog that was cremated with him. 4 years in which he had to undergo the furious attacks of an icy blast, the wind of obsidian, escape from voracious monsters, and at last crossed the 9 rivers, on the other side of which began Hades, And there, dissolving as it were into the void, he vanished totally and forever. It is likely that our sources have not told us all that there was to tell. Were the emperors and the dignitaries, for example, to go to Mictlan, even if they did die in their beds? What about the priests, who did not appear to come under any of the known headings? It is difficult to conceive that no afterlife was envisaged for them. As Huitzilopochtli is shown as the guarantor of the warrior's resurrection and blood luck of his peoples, then perhaps Quetzalcoatl, the prototype of the priest, had a future life in store for the ecclesiastics. However that may be, the prime decision of the creating period, the Lord and the Lady of the duality, established the ineluctable fate of not only of each man's earthly life, but also of his eternity. Everything depended upon the sign under which he was born. And it was this belief in signs, the expressions of fate, that had the greatest influence upon the life of every Mexican. Destinies and signs. From the Mayas, who seem to have been positively hypnotized by time and its majestic passage onwards, all the civilized nations of Mexico and Central America worked out complex chronological systems, and this for two purposes. The first was to find fixed points in order to understand and foresee the succession of natural phenomena, the seasons and movements of the stars, and so to regulate the rites that were necessary to their proper sequence. The second was to determine the fate of each man and the fortunes of each undertaking by means of a body of portents which made up a coherent whole, quite as scientific for those people as our rational explanations of the world are for us. The solar year, Shiwit, of 365 days, which was divided into 18 months of 20 days, to which were added 5 hollow days, thought of as exceedingly unfortunate. Each of these months had a name which had reference either to a natural phenomenon or, more often, to the rites which were to be celebrated during it. The year itself was named after the first day in it. The name was taken from the divinatory calendar, and it already contained concealed within it the potential good or evil of the year. Given that the number of days in the year, less the hollow days, is 360, and therefore divisible by 20, it is clear that if the year began, let us say, with the sign Akat, the first of the intercalary days had the same sign. But as there were 4 other intercalary days, the first day of the following year was therefore separated by 5 intervals from that of the preceding year. As 20 divided by 5 is 4, there were only 4 signs that could be used for the beginning of the year. In the days of the Aztecs, these were signs Akat, Tecpat, Gali, and Toshli. The 13 fundamental numerals of the divinatory calendar combined with the 4 signs to allow 13 times 4 equals 52 beginnings of the year. It was only at the end of this series that the same numeral and the same sign would recur, and then they set about binding the years by lighting the new fire. This period of 52 years, which is sometimes called the Mexican century, was represented by a bundle of stalks tied together. The Aztecs had learned, probably from their Pueblan or Mixtec neighbors, to observe the apparent revolution of the planet Venus. 5 years of Venus are the same as 8 years of the Sun. These years were counted by means of the signs of the divinatory calendar. The 2 accounts, that of the years of Venus and that of the years of the Sun, coincided only after 65 of the first, which are the equivalent of 104 of the second. That is to say, at the end of 2 earthly centuries. This was the longest period in the Mexican chronology, and it was called Se Huehue Tilitzli, one old age. As for the Tonapwali, or divinatory calendar itself, the Aztecs, like other Mexican nations, based it upon the combination of 13 numbers, 1 through 13, and 20 names. Cipacli, crocodile or aquatic monster. Eecat, wind. Gali, house. Quetzalpalin, lizard. Coat, snake. Biquitzli, death. Masat, deer. Toshli, rabbit. At, water. Itzcuintli, dog. Osomatli, monkey. Malanali, dead grass. Acat, reed. Ocelot, ocelot. Cuautli, eagle. Coscacuautli, vulture. Olin, motion or earthquake. Tekpat, flint. Kuyawit, rain. Xochitl, flower. Each name of a day was represented by a sign. The combination of the 13 numbers and the 20 signs gave us a series of 260 days, the duration of the divinatory year, which, beginning at 1 Sipat, ended on the day 13 Xochitl, running without interruption and without the same sign ever bearing the same figure. The continuous sequence of dates in the divinatory calendar and that of the dates in the solar year had no influence upon one another at all. Every day could be named by reference to the two symptoms. For example, Etzipakli Tritoshkat, that is the 8th day of the group of 13 days, which begins with 1 Ocelot, which is at the same time the 3rd day of the 5th month Toshkat. The divinatory year of 260 days split up naturally into 20 groups of 13, each of which began with the figure 1 with a different sign appropriated to it. 1 Sipakli, 1 Ocelot, 1 Masat, etc., and so on until the last 1 Toshli. Each of these groups was considered as a whole fortunate, unfortunate, or indifferent, according to the sense of its first day. But besides this, each of the days might be good, bad, or neutral according to its distinguishing number and sign. The days which had the numbers 7, 10, 11, 12, and 13 were held to be generally favorable, and those with the figure 9 unfavorable. But the influence of the figures had to be combined with that of the signs, and the divinatory calendar was in fact made up of a table of 260 special cases. Furthermore, each group of 13 was assigned to 1 or 2 gods. The sun and the moon for the group 1 Mikisli, Patekat, god of drink and drunkenness, for the group 1 Kuyat, the planet Venus and the god of the dead for the group 1 Goat, etc. Finally, 9 deities, the lords of the night, made up a series parallel with that of the signs and running in an uninterrupted sequence beside them. Their particular influence had certainly to be taken into account in the soothsayer's appreciation of any given day. It was also necessary to reckon with the influence peculiar to the year itself, and likewise that which the cardinal points of space might have upon these signs. For the Mexicans thought of the world as kind of a Maltese cross, the east uppermost, the north on the right, the west below, and the south on the left. The 20 signs for days were divided into 4 sets of 5, each ruled by one of the cardinal points. For example, the signs Sipakli and Akat belong to the east, Ocelot and Tekpat to the north, Masat and Gali to the west, and Xochitl and Toshli to the south. After this, each cardinal point in succession ruled one day, following the order east, north, west, and south, and also 1 year, also following the order Akat east, Tekpat north, Gali west, and Toshli south. Because of this, the day or the year was imbued with the qualities ascribed to each quarter: fertility and abundance to the east, barren aridity to the north, falling off old age and death to the west, setting sun, and a neutral character to the south. As for the groups of 13, they too underwent the influence of the cardinal points, and in the same order. For the first belonged to the east, the second to the north, the third to the west, the fourth to the south, and so on continuously. Thus, these spatial influences which rule time pitted into one another like so many hollow wooden Russian dolls. Or rather, it may be said that Mexican philosophy did not conceive one abstract space and one abstract time, homogeneous and separate media, but perhaps, on the other hand, concrete multiplicities of time and space, single points and happenings, disparate and unique. The qualities peculiar to each of these moment loci, expressed by the sign which indicated the days in the Tomapuali, follow one another cynically in an abrupt total change according to a determinate rhythm, in conformity with an everlasting order. When the duality decides that a man shall be born or come down, demo, he consequently finds himself inserted automatically into this order and in the grasp of the omnipotent machine. The sign of the day of his birth will govern him until the day of his death. It will even decide his death and so his afterlife. It will decide whether he is to die as a sacrifice and thus join the splendid retinue of the sun, or to be drowned and so inhabit the unendingly happy Tlalocan, or to be consigned to the void in the shadowy hereafter of Mictlan. His whole fate is subjected to the strictest predestination. There were certainly attempts at correcting fate, however. If a child were born under an unfortunate sign, some days were allowed to go by before naming him, until a fortunate sign should come. It was also conceded that by dint of penance, privation, and self-control, a man might escape the evil influences which doomed him, for example, to drunkenness, gambling, and debauchery. But it does not seem that there was ever much hope of avoiding the inexorable operation of these signs. They were at the base of everything, the fate of individuals and the fate of communities, and the gods themselves were not free. It was because the sign Akat ruled the destiny of Quetzalcoatl that he had to appear in the east in the shape of the morning star. Consequently, the life of the Mexican was dominated by the portents drawn from the Tonalamat. The merchants waited for day one Coat to begin their journey toward the remote countries of the south, because the sign promised them success and prosperity. Those who were born in the group 1 Ocelot would die as prisoners of war. Painters and scribes and weaving women particularly honored the sign Seven Xochitl, which was favorable to them. He who was born under the sign Tutochli would be a drunkard, and he who was born under the sign for Itzcuintli would be prosperous and rich, even if he never did anything. 1 Miquisli was favorable for slaves, 4 Ekat for wizards and black magic, 1 Cali for doctors and midwives. On the day for Orlean, the dignitaries sacrificed birds to the sun. On 1 Akat, they offered flowers, incense, and tobacco to Quetzalcoatl. It would not be too much to say that no Aztec, whatever his state or calling, could do without the services of the diviners, or undertake any enterprise without knowing the signs. Minds that were so very much under the dominion of fate could not be but uncommonly sensitive to omens, whether they were drawn from little everyday happenings or from extraordinary phenomena. An unaccustomed noise in the mountains, the cry of an owl, a rabbit running into a house, or a wolf crossing the road foretold disaster. That night, so favorable to so favorable to ghosts, filled itself with fantastic monsters, dwarfish women with flowing hair, death's heads that ran after travelers, footless, headless creatures that moaned as they rolled upon the ground. And those who saw them were persuaded or even convinced that they would be killed in a war or would presently die of an illness, or that some misfortune was about to fall upon them. Other portents foretold wars or defeats. These omens were those extraordinary kind of events that the Romans called portenta, and the Aztecs tetzawit. On the eve of the battle which ended in the victory of the Mexicans, a dog spoke to tell its master, an old man of Tlatelolco, of the misfortunes that were about to descend upon his town. The angry old man, having killed his dog, a huacholot, or turkey, which was spreading its tail in the courtyard of his house, opened its beak and spoke. The old man at Tlatelolco grew angrier still, and crying, "You shall not be my omen," or Amono Tino Tetzawa, cut the bird's head off. Then a mask for dancing that he kept hanging on the wall of his house spoke out, and the old man, disturbed by these 3 prodigies, went to tell the king Mokiwishitli. "You are drunk, are you not?" said the king. But a little while later, the king was struck down on the steps of his temple by the soldiers of Ashayakat. One day, the fowlers of the Mexican lake brought Moctezuma II a strange bird that they had just caught. In the middle of its head, the bird had a round mirror which showed the sky and the stars. When Moctezuma looked in his mirror, he saw a host of men, all armed and mounted on horses. He sent for soothsayers and asked them, "Do you know what I have seen? Here is a crowd of people coming." But before the soothsayers could reply, the bird vanished. The Codex Telerianoremensis depicts an immense streamer of light leaping from the earth to the stars under the year 4 Cali, or 1509. This phenomenon, which may have been the zodiacal light, was afterwards thought to have been the coming of the conquistadores. For many nights, said Ixtlisochitl, there appeared a great brightness that rose from the eastern horizon and reached the heavens. It was shaped like a pyramid, and it flamed. And the king of Texcoco, being extremely learned in all the sciences of the ancients, and particularly in astrology, concluded from this that his rule and his realm amounted to little. And at this time he ordered his captains and the commanders of his armies to put an end to the wars that they were waging. Comets and earthquakes, which were always carefully marked down each year in the hieroglyphic manuscripts, were always considered omens of misfortune. So was the lightning that struck a temple, or waves on the lake, there being no wind to cause them, or again the voice of a woman, such as that which was heard in the air a little before the invasion, moaning and wailing. Indeed, man but had an insignificant place in the Mexican vision of the world. He was governed by predestination. Neither his life nor his afterlife were in his own hands, and determinism ruled every phase of his short stay on earth. He was crushed under the weight of the gods and the stars. He was the prisoner of the omnipotent signs. The very world in which he made his brief struggle was no more than an ephemeral shape, one experiment among others, and like them doomed to catastrophe. Horror and horrifying monsters surrounded him on all sides. Ghosts and apparitions made their dark signals of despair. The moral climate of ancient Mexico was soaked in pessimism. The poems of the great king Nezahualcóyotl are haunted by the idea of death and annihilation. And even when the other poets celebrate the beauties of tropical nature, one feels that the obsession is there and that it takes them by the throat even amidst the flowers. Religion and the art that expresses religion through sculpture, and even the manuscripts whose glyphs enclose the wisdom of this ancient people, everything crushes man with the harshness of a fate that is beyond his control. But their nobility resided in this, that they accepted the world as they saw it. Theirs was an active pessimism. It did not result in a discouraged idleness, but in a fiery zeal for the sacred war, in ardent service of the gods, in the building of cities and the conquest of empires. Brought face to face with a pitiless universe, the Mexican did not attempt to veil it with illusions, but eked out the precarious scrap of life that the gods had granted him with an untamable strength, with labor and with blood. An imperial religion. The Aztec civilization, still young and still in its first flowering, had hardly begun when the European invasion cut short both its growth and the development and build-up of its religious philosophy. Such as it was at the eve of the catastrophe, or such as we understand it to have been, it seems to us both complicated and contradictory, made up of different contributions which have not yet been assimilated and merged into a coherent system. The Mexican was a receptive religion. The conquering Aztecs were only too happy to seize not only the provinces, but also the provincial gods. All foreign gods were welcome within the precincts of the great Teocalli, and the priest of Tenochtitlan, eager for knowledge and curious of the ritual, willingly adopted the myths and practices of the distant countries that his armies had traversed. This was the basis of the great misunderstanding between the Mexicans and the Spaniards. The first worshipped a great many gods and were willing to set up among them whatever the newcomers should bring. The second were the votaries of a closed religion whose churches could rise only upon the ruins of the former temples. The complexity of the Mexican religion is explained by the complexity of society and the state. If it is a reflection of the world, if it explains the world, still above it all, it reflects the complex society of which it is the expression. Then again, it had become the religion not only of a city, but of a very widely spread and diversified confederation. We have little knowledge of the form that the piety of the peasants and plebeians took. There is evidence of the belief of the old agricultural nations such as the Otomi in the primordial junction of sun and earth, father and mother, and this is found again among the Nahuatl Mexicans in the form of the primordial couple, the Lord and the Lady of Duality, as well as in the invocations which are invariably addressed to the Sun Father and the Earth Mother. We also know that there were deities for districts and guilds, such as Yacatecutli, god of the merchants, Coyotlinawa, god of the feather workers, Huixtocihuat, goddess of these halters, Atlawa, god of the fowlers on the lake. The stellar gods of the nomads from the north had combined with the gods of rain and agriculture, which the settled tribes had worshipped since before the Christian era. And in the course of the time, Huastec gods like Tlasos Deot or Yopi gods like Xipetotec had been brought in, together with all the little gods of drink and the harvest known as the Senson Totochtli, or the 400 rabbits. In this many-sided pantheon were assembled the beliefs and the aspirations of different social classes and of various peoples. The myth cycle of the sun is preeminently the religion of the warriors devoted to battle and sacrifice. Quetzalcoatl is the ideal of priests yearning for holiness. Tlaloc is the great god of the peasants. Mixcoatl, the god of the northern peoples, had his devotees as well as Xipetotec, lord of the coast, and the plumed serpent of the Toltecs, and the coronal goddess of the eastern nations. Each step of the social ladder had its god or gods, and each subdivision of living place or work, and each village or city. It is the imperial religion of a great state that is in the process of formation, but that is still no more than a confederation of many little highly individual states, each with its own history and traditions and often its own language. Just as the political institutions at the summit tended to grow stronger and to find the formation necessary for an imperial state, so the meditation of the priest tended to bring into order this theological chaos. A syncretism was coming into being, but unhappily, though the confused, obscure accounts, we can apprehend only a few aspects of it. Some gods had risen above the crowd, and through them the Mexican thinkers attempted to bring about the religious synthesis that was essential to them. This they did by endowing the great gods with multiple attributes, by stating that many of the divine names were synonyms for these gods, and by postulating genealogies to link them together. Tezcatlipoca, in particular, seems to have been becoming the guiding principle in the world of gods. According to one of the traditions, the first pair begot 4 sons, who were the creators of the other gods and of the world. The red Tezcatlipoca, identified with Xipetotec, and Camachli or Mixcoatl, the black Tezcatlipoca, who was the Tezcatlipoca usually worshipped under that name. The blue Tezcatlipoca, who was no other than Huitzilopochtli, and finally Quetzalcoatl. Thus, the positions of a whole series of divine persons are fixed in relation to the 4 great directions in space, and at the same time, the number of persons is reduced to 2, Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl. Huitzilopochtli, a parvenu, a newcomer with his tribe, is integrated. So is Xipetotec, a foreign god. There is a comparable work of synthesis apparent in books like the Borgia and Cospiano manuscripts, which probably come from the regions of Puebla, Tepeaca, Tehuacan, and Tlaxcala. Some distant towns, such as Tenochtitlan on the frontier of Oaxaca, were well known for the wisdom and the meditations and of their priests. Quetzalcoatl, who was particularly venerated at Cholula in the same region as Puebla, was also one of those whose statue rose high above that of the ordinary run of gods. As we have seen, one tradition made him the equal of Tezcatlipoca. He was the Toltec god, the god of the settled civilized people of the high plateau, the inventor of the arts, of writing, and of the calendar. He was the expression of everything that makes life kinder and more lovely, as well as that of the planet Venus, with its message of resurrection. It was right, therefore, to set up against him the somber northern god of the night sky, of war and magic. For the legend of Tula told how Tezcatlipoca the wizard had turned the beneficent king, god king, out of his town and condemned the plumed serpent to exile. So at least in some circles, in the Calmecac, where the erudite priests studied the many-colored manuscripts or watched the march of the stars by night, a new conception arose, that of a divine world dominated by a small number of beings, or mythical personalities, each with many aspects. Some went further. The pious king Nezahualcóyotl erected a temple dedicated to the unknown god, creator of all things, who was called Tloque Nahuaque, he of the immediate vicinity, or Ipanemohuani, he by whom we live. On the top of this temple was a tower with 9 stories, which stood for 9 heavens, and the 10th, which finished these 9 stories, was painted black and studded with stars outside, while the inside was adorned with gold, gems, and precious feathers. And this god, whom no man had either known or seen up to that time, was not represented by any statue or idol. This cult in no way hindered Nezahualcóyotl from worshipping a great many other gods at the same time. There was no monotheism here, but rather a belief in a supreme god raised above all the others, nameless, since the words which designate him are no more than epithets, with no history in myth, and faceless. It is very likely that these philosophical and theological speculations were confined to a small circle of people high in the state and in the church. The villagers of the high plateau or the tropical lands would certainly never have admitted that their local gods were inferior to any great deity, and the people of the various districts of the capital no doubt preferred the gods of their little temples, near to them and attached to them by tradition, to the abstract divinities of the priests. In any case, one thing is certain, and that is that this religion, with its scrupulous and exacting ritual and the profusion of its myths, penetrated, in all aspects, deeply into the everyday life of men. Continuously and totally, it molded the existence of the Mexican nation. Everything was under its domination, public life and private life, each stage of each person's progress from birth to death, the rhythm of time, the arts and even games, nothing escaped. It was this religion which, like a powerful frame, upheld the whole edifice of the Mexican civilization. So, when once this frame was broken by the invaders, it was not surprising that the entirety should have fallen into ruins. This concludes Chapter 3.